It's hard to believe that 150 years ago this week, an army of young men from New York, Pennsylvania, and other northern states fought another army of young men from Virginia, South Carolina, and other southern states at a site just 5 miles north of this church. Both armies were ragtag affairs. Their soldiers were poorly trained, poorly equipped. Most had been civilians just a few weeks and in some cases a few days before the battle. Their officers too were largely untrained and untested. While it's true that some on both sides had been graduates of West Point and were in fact classmates, many had received their commissions because they were successful politicians, wealthy landowners, or successful businessmen. Discipline was often a joke. Even on the day of the battle, as they advanced on their enemies, if a column chanced upon an inviting blackberry patch, soldiers were likely to break ranks to pick and eat fruit. Advances stopped until frustrated officers, those who hadn't joined their men that is, could cajole them back on task. Both sides were supremely confident, cocky actually. It was widely believed among Confederates that one rebel could take out 3, 4, even 6 Yankees if need be. Yankees thought of the rebels as backward, cowardly hicks. Both sides were convinced that all they needed to do was rattle their swords and fire their weapons in the general vicinity of their enemy, who would immediately turn tail and run. Both sides vastly underestimated the strength and resolve of the other. Both sides, too, were convinced that their cause was just. Southerners were defending their homeland, families, and very way of life from what they clearly saw as invaders from the north. Northerners were putting down a rebellion of malcontents so as to restore the union of states that was the country they loved. Both sides were convinced that God was on their side, that justice would prevail, that victory was easily at hand. And so they came. The Northern Army moved west from their encampment near Washington, D.C., stopping briefly at Centerville, and on the morning of July 21st, 1861, moved out. Their goal was the strategically important railhead known as Manassas Junction, today's Manassas. From there, the Southerners moved out to meet them where the Warrenton Turnpike crossed Bull Run, a nondescript stream that snaked its way sleepily through northern Virginia countryside. What a battle it was. The first units moved out at 2:30 in the morning. The actual fighting raged for 8 hours on that hot, sultry Sunday in July. And by 6:30 that evening, it was over. The Northern Army had been routed and was fleeing back to Washington in utter disarray. The Southern Army, while victorious, was too spent to mount an effective pursuit. 900 soldiers were dead. 3,000 were wounded. And the nearly 56,000 other men who had participated in the battle were changed forever, as was indeed the nation. Never again would we look forward to war. Never again would we so tragically underestimate our enemy. Never again after that war would we expose our soldiers by marching them in well-formed ranks and files into the face of withering gunfire. In one day, 900 dead, 3,000 wounded. The rest scarred for life, a nation changed forever. Hard to believe, isn't it? States warring against each other, Virginians and New Yorkers killing each other in our neighborhood. How could such a thing happen? It's a question that has engaged historians for 150 years. But there is, I think, a more interesting question. Today, war between the states is virtually unthinkable. What happened to change our national psyche from war between the states is possible to war between the states is unthinkable? Whatever it was, the process was well underway by July 21st, 1911, 50 years to the day since the infamous battle, 100 years ago this week. It was then that the National Jubilee of Peace and Reconciliation occurred here in Manassas. The Jubilee ran from Sunday, July 16th, through Friday, July 21st. For a week, there were church services and concerts and receptions and lots of speeches. Every night on the Manassas courthouse grounds just down the street from here, campfires were lit, and veterans of both sides regaled audiences of up to 2,000 with remembrances of the famous battle. But the culmination of the Jubilee was set for Friday, July 21st. Once again they gathered, nearly 1,000 veterans of that fateful day 50 years before. Once again the combatants were accompanied by onlookers, but this time the onlookers outnumbered the soldiers nearly 10 to 1. The event captured the imagination of the nation. 10,000 onlookers, 1,000 former soldiers. Once again, the soldiers formed lines and faced each other on Henry Hill, now part of the Manassas Battlefield National Park. Once again, Northerners faced Southerners. They were much older now. The youngest were in their 60s, most were in their 70s and 80s. They had not only survived the battle, they had survived the war, and had far outlived their life expectancy for that day. Once again, a signal was given and the lines advanced toward each other. But this time, the roars of battle and the cries of the wounded and dying were replaced by cheers from the onlookers. And this time, when they met, they greeted each other not with shot and bayonet, but with smiles and handshakes. Peace had come to Henry Hill. Peace had come to a grateful nation. President Taft drove out by motor car from Washington that day to give a speech. The trip took nearly all day. In it, he said, "The greatest ambition I have as President of the United States is to do everything sensible and everything reasonably possible to bring the two sections of the country even closer together, if that be possible. To make them feel in the South as well as in the North that the Supreme Court of the United States is their Supreme Court, the Congress their Congress, the President of the United States their President." The process of reconciliation was well underway. What a contrast between those two hot, sultry July days in Manassas, Virginia. How did this happen? What had changed to allow once deadly foes to greet each other in friendship and forgiveness? I submit that basically what changed was our perception of each other. We stopped identifying ourselves simply as New Yorkers and Georgians, Pennsylvanians and Virginians. We began to perceive ourselves first and foremost as Americans. It was no longer a case of our soldiers killing their soldiers. War between the states became unthinkable when we began to rightly see that the Civil War was us killing ourselves. We became one nation, under one flag, one people, undivided and indivisible. And when we saw ourselves as one with the other, war between us became unthinkable. The process may well have begun on the day of the battle. Combatants approached each other convinced of their superiority, convinced of the other's vast inferiority. A day of the heaviest fighting the country had ever seen put to lie those misconceptions. Both sides saw that the other was just as brave and dedicated as they were. One Confederate soldier said of the Yankee prisoners the South took that day, "They looked so pitiful, I believe I could have given them a drink of water if they'd asked me for it." A small chink of empathy in the wall of loathing and distrust that separated the two sides. This is not the only instance where once warring people learned to live together in peace. In South Africa, much the same is occurring. Here the basis of separation is racial, blacks against whites. Europeans discovered South Africa in the 15th century, and soon after began moving into the territory in large numbers. Tensions and conflicts between colonizing whites and indigenous blacks was almost immediate. At first, South Africa was a Dutch colony, then a British colony, and in 1910 became the Union of South Africa. In 1948, apartheid became the law of the land. Under this system, people were classified in the races whites, coloreds, or black. The system was skewed so that whites had most of the advantages and privileges, blacks had few, if any. Blacks were forced to live in ghettos, their travel was restricted, their employment and educational opportunities were few, and when they could find work, black workers were, for the most part, grossly underpaid. To make things even worse, apartheid was enforced with a harsh system of justice. Resistors were arrested, imprisoned, beaten, and tortured. Many served long prison sentences. Many died. In the late 1980s, under intense international pressure, apartheid rules began to be relaxed. In 1991, F.W. de Klerk, the white president of South Africa, declared an official end to apartheid. From that point forward, all races in South Africa were recognized as equal, with equal opportunities, rights, and benefits. In 1994, Nelson Mandela, who had been in prison for 27 years, was elected South Africa's first black president. Today, South Africans live together in remarkable harmony. In spite of obvious differences in cultural heritage, race, social status, for the most part, they accept each other. Their journey from adversary to neighbor has been remarkably swift and complete. How did they do it? What was their secret? I submit that basically they stopped perceiving their differences and accepted instead their commonality. Yesterday they were blacks or whites, rich or poor, privileged or oppressed. Today they are South Africans, first and foremost. All those other differences, including racial identity, have become secondary. Whites and blacks came to realize that the best interests of one group are identical to the best interest of the other. With that, the concept of other dissolved. White and black South Africans have become one people living in one country with one common destiny and one common fate. The same process of reconciliation between foes seems to be working itself out in Northern Ireland. Here the basis of conflict is a complex mixture of religion and politics and tradition. For centuries, the region has been the site of countless conflicts, pitting Protestants against Catholics and pitting those content to remain a part of Great Britain against those wishing to be free of what they see as the British yoke. Today, 40% of Northern Ireland's population is Roman Catholic. Basically, they see themselves as Irish, but their views are complex. The majority would like to see Northern Ireland become part of the neighboring Republic of Ireland, with a large minority preferring to see Northern Ireland become an independent nation, separate from both England and Ireland. Contrasting the Catholics is their nemesis, the Protestant majority. Basically, they are content to remain British citizens and have no desire to change national identity. For centuries, periods of violence have alternated with periods of uneasy peace. The recent Troubles, as they are called, started in the late 1960s. Well-armed paramilitary units from both sides, Catholic nationalists and Protestant loyalists, carried out systematic, widespread violence that closely resembled civil war. British soldiers and emissaries did what they could to maintain or enforce peace, but often their efforts were not only ineffectual, often they inflamed the situation further. In the late 1990s, both sides seemed to grow weary of the near-constant violence. And in 1998, a political agreement was reached by both sides that marked the end to systematic violence. Britain has granted Northern Ireland semi-autonomous rights in which powers are shared between Catholics and Protestants. Citizens elect their Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, and a national parliament. This political activity has gone far to give the people of Northern Ireland a sense of national identity. Violence still occurs, but is relatively rare. Most importantly, retaliations for violence, so common in the past, are for the most part not triggered. Is this current situation simply another uneasy lull between extended periods of violence? It remains to be seen. But the fact is that the vast majority of Northern Ireland citizens want peace. The instances of people on both sides reaching out to each other, tentatively, hopefully, peacefully, is encouraging. We can only hope that they are successful. Vietnam, too, has experienced recent reconciliation between its North and South. There's the Rocky story. Here are some of the highlights. For the past 2,700 years, Vietnam has been successively bedeviled and befriended by its large northern neighbor, China. A little over 1,000 years ago, it gained its independence, but lost it to the Japanese during the Second World War. After the war, Vietnam was occupied by the French. Civil war began almost immediately between the Viet Minh, aided by China and the Soviet Union in the north, and the French and Vietnamese, aided by the United States in the south. In 1954, the French were defeated, and Vietnam was partitioned into the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, also known as North Vietnam in the north, and the Republic of Vietnam, also known as South Vietnam in the south. Again, war between the two broke out almost immediately. At first, the United States attempted to play only an advisory role to the South Vietnamese, but our involvement gradually escalated, particularly in the early 1960s, and it turned into one of the longest, least popular wars in American history. On April 30th, 1975, with the fall of Saigon City, hostilities ended and the Americans withdrew. An uneasy peace settled over Vietnam. What happened next was complex and poorly documented. It's clear that reunification has not been easy. Officially, the process started in 1975, but in fact, this was the first time that what is now Vietnam was configured within its present borders. Thus, the people of Vietnam have few cultural or historic reasons to feel united. Another complicating factor has been the fact that by the time reunification started, people in the North had been fighting people in the South for over 25 years. A whole generation of animosity would have to be overcome. The first 10 years of reunification have been described as the northernization of the South, as the centralized northern government took over administrative control of the South, and when southern property and farmland were taken over by the government. Economic reform started in 1986 in what has been described as the start of the southernization of the North. Although Vietnam remains one of the poorest countries in the region, reforms have been generally successful. Economic conditions are at least better than they were in the past, particularly in the cities, and the people of Vietnam seem generally content. The status of reunification today is complex and generational. Older citizens still remember the war. Those in the North still don't trust those of the South, and older citizens in the South still don't trust those in the North. Nothing comparable to the Manassas Jubilee of Peace has apparently occurred in Vietnam. But things are apparently different with the younger generation, which makes up the bulk of the population. They seem to have outlived their history. Those in the South are generally content to be dependent on the North for leadership and governance, while those in the North depend on the South for the nation's economic livelihood. As the next generation replaces the old, a sense of unity seems to be developing. Perhaps resulting from a series of historical accidents, the people of Vietnam find themselves living together in a single country. They are beginning to see themselves as one nation and one people. Peace, at least within the country, seems attainable. 4 examples of once bitter foes at least beginning to live together in peace. And in each case, the key to peace seems to be tied to a change in perception. As long as we perceive differences in the group we define as other, the potential for violence exists. But when we see the other as ourselves, the very notion of other dissolves, and with it the potential of violence. Would that we could extend this idea to other conflicts. For example, wouldn't it be wonderful if American Christians and Middle Eastern Muslims could see each other as one? But how could we? We don't worship the same God, we don't live in the same country or speak the same languages. Our histories are different, our cultures are different, we look different. Our differences are obvious and real, aren't they? Well, let's look again. Biologically, we're the same cells, same DNA, same basic needs for fresh air, clean water, and food. We suffer the same illnesses and respond the same to friendship and nurturance. We are also the same socioeconomically and politically. Basically, we all want the same 4 things: available, meaningful economic opportunities, educational opportunities for our children, access to adequate health care, especially for our children, and a sense that we can control our own destinies. We all crave respect. We all need to love and be loved. Certainly there are differences between us, but aren't our similarities just as real? just as significant, just as important. When American Christians and Middle Eastern Muslims look at each other, we need not see differences. We could see similarities. And if we did, the potential for violence between us would lessen, perhaps cease. The same could be said for our issues with illegal immigrants, gays and straights, males and females. Indeed, wherever we have conflict, peace could be restored if only we could see our similarities rather than differences. Our seventh principle tells us that we are all part of an interconnected web of existence. It tells us that all people are interconnected and interdependent. In fact, we are all one. I submit that every conflict we find ourselves in, at whatever level of society, could be lessened in insignificance if only we could see ourselves as one with the other. We are, in fact, one. We are all one. We are all